Welcome to our December session of Table Topper of the Months with Riley Blake Designs. This month we're working on the pattern called Star Bright, designed by pattern designer Amy Smart, who is also a Riley Blake fabric designer. So this month it's actually a pretty easy pattern. We're going to put together 9 identical blocks joined with sashing and a cornerstone. So let's take a look at all the details and important steps that I want to point out to help you be successful in completing this project. So in your pattern, if you look at your cutting instructions that you will find on page 1 of the pattern, everything is pretty self-explanatory in the pattern in terms of what goes where. But there are a few things that I want to point out. So in your pattern, there is a painter's watercolor swirl that they have you cut 9 3 3/4 inch squares. They have to be cut once you have cut your squares, cut on both diagonals. So we're going to cut from one corner to the other, and then we're going to move the ruler and cut one corner to the other. Now, here is the most important thing that I can tell you, is that I would highly suggest, if you are not starching all of your fabrics for this project, that if you do anything, is that you starch the fabrics that you're going to be cutting for these colors here. This cutting the square on both diagonals is going to give you some bias edges that we're going to have to then go and sew. And if you're not careful, you can stretch that bias edge before we are ready for it to be stretched. Well, we don't really want it stretched at all, but we are going to cut this on both diagonals. So I'm going to stack them up here just so you can see. My fabric is starched. I am going to cut from one corner. Kind of line it back up here. I like to do this on the corner of a table so that I can walk around the corner if I want. I don't really want to have to pick these up and move them. And we're going to cut diagonally again. Very carefully, you want to not really overhandle these diagonal edges more than anything. We want to be careful because what's going to happen is they will get all stretched out and funny, and then you're not going to be able to get a nice unit like this one that we're going to be putting into our block center. So we have, those are all cut on the diagonal, both diagonals, but we do have one square that is also cut on one diagonal that is done out of the white with the blue polka dot, the pin dot. So this one is the 3 3/8 inch square. And if you're not a huge proponent of cutting those 3/8 and 8s, you would be perfectly fine to square this up to 3.5. So if you cut yourself a 3.5 inch square, that'll give you a little bit more room. And this whole unit is going to get squared down and trimmed down in a little bit. But once you have that 3 3/8 to 3.5 inch square cut, we are going to cut this on one diagonal. Again, I have this fabric starched because this is a bias edge that we're going to be sewing, but not sewing it as it's sewn together. Because normally if we were going to do a half square triangle, we would sew diagonally, but the bias is encased. We're now going to be working with those already open. And so it can be a little iffy because this is going to become basically part of this. And by cutting this a little bit bigger, we give ourselves a little bit more room in order to make sure that we are going to be able to get a 3-inch square out of this when we are done. You're going to work through cutting everything else, pretty squares and rectangles, not hard at all. The first step that we're going to make is flying geese. Just like we've been making flying geese for the last, I don't know, what are we on? 9 months, 10 months. You're going to take your body or your main rectangle, which is of your baby or boy blue confetti solid. We are going to place a painter's swirl in the left-hand corner, and the right-hand corner will be the pin dot. So be very, very careful at making sure that you are placing them in the right location. All 36 flying geese units need to be identical in order for your squares to look the same. So on the back of the square, we've drawn a line from corner to corner. We've sewn on that line, or you can use your folded corner clipper. We're going to trim 1/4 inch from that line. Just like that. Then we're going to want to press this seam open. I have not put my studio back together after retreat, so I do not have an iron back here quite yet. Need to get to that. And then we're going to repeat the step with the denim pin dot in the right-hand corner. So again, take your pin dots. You can draw a diagonal line from one corner to the other, or use your folded corner clipper, which is still packed from the retreat. We introduced a lot of people to that folded corner clipper. And then we're going to place that on top of our pressed flying geese body with the diagonal line starting at the painter's swirl blue, working to the lower right-hand corner. And then we'll sew on that line and then fold back and press this open. This unit should measure 3 inches by 5.5 inches when it is complete. So 3 by 5.5. You're going to make 36 of them. All right. Now, our next step is to create our little pinwheel. So again, in creating this pinwheel, we have a specific location where fabric needs to go. We are going to be sewing blue on the right, dot on the left. We're going to be sewing the straight edge of the triangles, not the diagonals, but the straight edges. And if I remember my geometry, I could tell you the exact certain angles, hypotenuses, and all that stuff. But we're going to sew the non-bias edges is what we're going to sew first. So we're going to lay them out. You're going to be making 36 of these, so you could chain piece this. So we're going to lay them out. We're going to put them right sides together, match the corner, your straight edge, and we're going to sew 1/4 inch. And we're going to do the same on the other one. You're going to want to go and do this. We are going this direction. And then we're going to head over to the machine and we're going to sew 1/4 inch down the straight edge. I highly recommend that you pin that or clip that, because if you end up sewing this one when you get over to the sewing machine and you have flipped them, you will not have your fabrics going in the right direction. Head over to the machine and sew some triangles. Back from the sewing machine, I got my little kite tail going on here. I'm going to cut these apart and we're going to head to the ironing board and we're going to press these seams open. And you want to make sure you press. No ironing, because this here is bias. So if we do too much stretching or pulling here, then it's not going to lay super nice and super flat for you. So you want to pay careful attention to that particular edge. If you've starched your fabric, you don't have to be as sensitive, but definitely want to be super sensitive if you are not using starched fabric for this. I'm just going to finger press these open. Now, I do want to make note that I am using a slightly different size square for this project, for this demonstration, this video. I wanted to make sure that I could use the same fabrics for you guys. And these were all done out of scraps left from the project. And I couldn't get the exact size units out. So it's just fine. Pay attention to my numbers, but not what you may see here. So we have all of our little 1/4 triangle, so a pieced half triangle here for our project, if you want to call it. And we're now going to take those 3 3/8 or 3.5 inch squares that we cut on one diagonal, and this is going to go to it. Now, again, remember, I'm not using actual sizes that you have. So this is way bigger and way bigger than what yours will be, but the end result will be the same. If you did cut your square larger, if you wanted, you could kind of fold this in half carefully, roughly line it up to the middle seam. And we're going to go over to the sewing machine and you can sew that at 1/4 inch. So I've sewn this one already. These were smaller than what was needed to be cut. This was the original size. So just make note, you may not have as much excess as I did. We're going to go ahead and sew this. We are going to press the seam towards the larger triangle. So you're going to lay that on the ironing board. You're going to set your seam, and then we're going to fold back and set the iron on it to set it. None of this, okay? Because this is a bias, this is bias. These are straight grain. They don't really pull because we've sewn the bias here. So you want to be very careful. If you should need to seam rip the seam, because this is the bias edge on this triangle. And if we just, want to seam rip and yank or anything like that, this is not going to give you a nice straight edge anymore, and it's not going to lay flat. So we're going to press the seam towards the larger triangle. We are then going to trim this unit down to a 3-inch square. Now, mine is not going to be a 3-inch square again because not the right size squares, but what you're going to do is you're going to, for right-handers, you will put your diagonal from upper right to lower left. For my left-handers, you will put your diagonal upper left to lower right. And I'm going to take a square ruler and I'm going to lay the diagonal of this square ruler along that seam. I'm going to trim mine to a 2.5 inch square just so that you can see. So I'm going to slide this down, keeping that diagonal line on that seam. I want to make sure that I have a little bit of fabric that is sticking out past 2.5 on all the 2 sides under the ruler. If we have anything less than 2.5, this block is never going to be able to be 2.5. So, but I want to have a little bit sticking out so that I have something that I can trim. I'm going to trim up the side and across the top. Then I'm going to take this block and I'm going to flip it 180 degrees. I'm going to replace that diagonal line again. And I'm going to put, for me, 2.5 on my cut edge. You would put 3 inches on your cut edge. And I'm going to cut up and cut up. So, end result for you would be a 3-inch square. That's why I said it's okay if you want to cut this one slightly larger. Just gives you a little bit more room to be able to get to an exact 3-inch square. You are going to make 36 of them. Once we make all of those, we're going to start putting blocks together. With this project, we are going to assemble the center unit first. So watch the diagram for exactly how to lay out your block. You're going to sew 2 together, press seams in opposite directions, or if you like, you can press them open, but we just pressed in opposite directions. Put them right sides together and sew through the middle. I would swirl press this center unit that is right here. So let me turn our quilt over here. Okay. So see, seams pressed opposite directions. This little swirl press, if you remember, we talked about it before, but we have a few stitches right in the center past where you would have done the last seam that you remove. And then you can allow one seam to flip up and one seam to flip down. And then that just helps this to lay flatter. You're not going to get that on the right side of your project. You're not going to get that party hat kind of look that you may get. Your long armor will like you will probably get a better point or a better center to your pinwheel if you swirl press that open. Now, once we've assembled this unit, we're going to attach a flying geese unit to each side of it. This should be a 5.5 inch square, this center section. 5.5 inches square. We're going to attach a flying geese unit to each side. And then we're going to press those seams open. We're going to attach a 3-inch square to each side of this flying geese, top and bottom. And then we're going to sew that to the top and bottom of our unit to create our star. This block should be a 10.5 inch square. Now, another note, if you're watching this before you actually cut, do not cut your sashing strips until your blocks are finished. If your blocks don't come out to being 10.5, you will cut your sashing strip to the size that your blocks come out to be. Your cornerstones are fine. They're still going to be that size. So you can cut your 2-inch strips. Just don't cut them down to the 2 by 10.5s that the pattern calls for. Leave them as just full strips until you finish your blocks and you get a measurement. I'd hate for you to have to come back and recut all of these smaller, or maybe your block ends up bigger and then you don't have enough fabric to recut them at the larger size. So don't cut them into subcuts until after this unit is made. When we go to assemble this together, basically you're going to sew a row that is cornerstone, sashing, cornerstone, sashing, cornerstone, sashing, cornerstone. And then you're going to sew a row of blocks, starting with a sashing and ending with a sashing. And you will repeat that and then join this together. Pretty simple, basic quilt assembly. See, we opted to press seams of our blocks into the sashing row so that it didn't show through. And our seams on our... Let's turn it the other way because this is the way it was assembled. The sashing row seams go away from the whirly blue cornerstone. The block rows, the seams go into the center. That will give you a nesting point to be able to match and get a nice cornerstone. When you're all finished, it's time to layer and quilt your block. This project shows some very basic, again, piece quilting. Some of it, all of the quilting in the blocks could be done with a walking foot. Pretty basic stitching here. We've got some echo quilting done in the bodies of the flying geese. There's a little square that's been done in the corners of the stars. And then what they've done in the center unit here, there's like a little swirl in each one of these. So you could easily do this in groups of 2 if you wanted. You could stitch in the ditch. There is some echo quilting that is happening in that section of the flying geese, and it's repeated in all of the same squares. The sashing and the cornerstones were done with a ribbon candy, swirl, free motion, or even ruler work that could be done. And then your project is ready to be bound. This project is designed for you to use a 2 1/4 inch binding. We did note or did find that there really wasn't enough fabric to allow you to cut a 2 1/2 inch binding. So you do want to be cautious when you are doing your cutting your binding. I would, before you start cutting, if you really prefer 2 1/2 inch binding, measure out what you have remaining of your dark blue fabric and then calculate the math to make sure you have enough to cut the number of strips needed. So because we're using 2 1/4 inch binding, that means that I will sew my binding on to the quilt with a 1/4 inch seam. Okay. If I personally use a 2 1/2 inch binding and sew with a 3/8 inch seam, but everybody has their method. Well, I hope that we get to see all your beautiful Star Bright table toppers in time to grace your tables in January. And we will see you back again at the beginning of next month. Thanks, everybody. Have a wonderful holiday.